G'day everyone, Viv here. I hope you're all keeping well. It's time to learn to play Saga. Now before we jump into the how do I move and how do I shoot and how do we fight sort of business, I thought we'd spend a couple of moments talking about force composition. How do I put an army together to play Saga? Now Saga is a fairly small scale game. It uses a points system, generally 4 points or 6 points. Now those points I get to spend to recruit a certain number of men into my army. At the beginning of the game I get to determine how I'm going to deploy those, but we'll talk about that later on. So when I spend 1 point in Saga, I get to recruit a certain number of men, and of a specific type of men. So there are 3 types in Saga. They're all called different things depending on which faction you play, but grouped together they are your Hearthguard, they are your elite units. You have your warriors, they are the mainstay of your army. And you have your levies. They're your peasant farmers who have been sort of hesitantly dragged into battle. They're the 3 unit types. Now, when I spend 1 point on either of these units, I recruit a certain number of men. So I can spend 1 point on Hearthguard, I can spend 1 point on warriors, and I can spend 1 point on levies. When I spend a point on Hearthguard, I get 4 of them. When I spend a point on warriors, I get 8 of them. And when I spend a point on levies, I get 12 of them. So you can see now if I say I'm going to play a 4-point game, I get the choice now to be quite diverse in how I structure or how I recruit men into my army. I might invest 4 points into 4, I'll use the term units, but we'll talk about units later on, 4 units of Hearthguard. So basically I'm recruiting 16 Hearthguard into my army. 1 point buys me 4 men, and if I'm spending 4 points, then 4 by 4 is 16. I might spend 1 point on Hearthguard, which gets me 4. I might spend 2 points on warriors, which gets me 16 models, and another point on levies, which gets me 12 models, which gives me, 34 models if my maths is correct. So if we have a look at the mathematics of the game, the largest, if I'm spending 6 points, let's say we're playing a 6-point game, the smallest number of models I can have in my army will be 25. I have 1 model for my warrior and 6 points spent into Hearthguard, remembering that 1 point buys me 4 Hearthguard, so 6 by 4 is 24, plus my warrior is 25 models. Purely elite force. Whereas if I went the completely other route and went all levies, the maximum number of models I'll have will be 73. Now you're highly unlikely to have an all levies army simply because of the way that mechanics work. The army simply wouldn't function properly. And again, we'll talk about mechanics and all that sort of stuff as we move forward. So when I'm structuring a force for Saga, generally I'm playing a 4-point game or a 6-point game. I guess you could play a 5-point game, but generally it's 4 points or 6 points. So in this series of videos we'll talk about a 4-point force. It's basically the smallest force or the smallest points limit out of the 2 that you can use to play the game. So in this series we'll talk about the orders phase, which is the very first turn, the Saga dice, the battle boards that various factions use. We'll talk about the activations phase, and the activations phase is pretty simple basically. Movement, shooting, resting. We'll obviously talk about shooting and melee and the results that fatigue have on both of those types of engagements with your enemy. And we'll talk about what are the victory conditions, how do I win the game. So hopefully we can cover all of that maybe in 3 to 4 videos. Hopefully we'll see. In this video, first part, talk about force composition, basically spending those points on recruiting a certain number of models. And when we jump into the examples in a minute, it might make a bit more sense. We'll also talk about deployment, because it's generally the same for most of the scenarios in the first rulebook, and generally I suppose would be the method I guess you'd use if you were going to devise your own scenarios or play a pitch battle or something like that. So let's stop messing around, let's have a look at that deployment and jump into the series on how to learn Saga. Let's talk for a moment about the composition of the army. Before we spoke about the certain number of points that I can spend, and here we have my Anglo-Saxon army. My warlord in the center here, his always costs nothing, unless we choose one of the heroes of the Viking Age, which we'll talk about later on. So my hero costs nothing, so I've got, at this point, 4 points to spend. Now I've chosen in this army to take 1 point's worth of Hearthguard, buys me 4 models. A 2nd point's worth of Hearthguard, again buys me 4 models, so 8 Hearthguard altogether. And then I've spent a 3rd point into a unit of warriors, or 8 warriors, and a 4th point into a 2nd selection of 8 warriors. So altogether, I've got 8 Hearthguard, 16 warriors, and my warlord there in the center. This is the recruitment of my force. How I actually deploy this really depends on the scenario that I'm playing, what my opponent is playing, and I get to have some variation. These are my men. When I deploy, I choose how I'm going to set them up into various units. So let's have a look, now that we've got a 4-point force, how I actually begin a game in terms of deploying my units onto the table and progress forward from there. So let's talk about deploying my army onto the table. Before we do that, I just want to point out that Saga uses a measurement system that refers to various lengths as very short, short, medium, and long. So I've got this little piece of dowel, it's a small piece of wood, with the measurements marked out on it. And essentially, I mean, you could use a tape measure, but very short is 2 inches, short is 4 inches, medium is 6 inches, and long is 12 inches. Now I use this piece of dowel because it makes it easier to do movement and measure things out, rather than having sort of a tape measure that you're extending out over the table continuously. So given that the maximum distance that you'll ever use, bar some very, very rare special rules for shooting and stuff like that, the maximum distance that you're going to need is going to be long. So I use this piece of dowel. So let's talk about deployment. Here at the back of the table, and you can see this hedgerow in the middle is representing the edge of my table. Behind that I've got all of my guys that I recruited into my force. So my warlord, my 8 Hearthguard, and my 16 warriors. At this point I've just separated them into the groups that I recruited them in. 8 warriors, 4 Hearthguard, 8 warriors. Before deployment, at the beginning of the game, I decide how I want to structure my force. What units do I want to create out of this body of men? Now, the smallest units that you can have to have a minimum of 4. And the largest units can be a maximum of 12. 12 models. So my unit of 4 Hearthguard is the smallest. My unit of 12 levies is the largest, but that's not to say that at the beginning of the game, I'm going to say that my 8 Hearthguard that I've recruited, I am merging into 1 unit of Hearthguard. And that's not to say that my 8 warriors that I recruited as a group, I'm not going to split up into 2 smaller units of warriors of 4 men each. Both of them legitimate formations. I might say I'm going to have 1 unit of 4 warriors and a much larger unit of 12 warriors. Again, considering I don't have any levies in my army, but I'm going to have 1 unit of 12 warriors, a unit of 4 warriors, and a unit of 8 Hearthguard. I get to choose how I build my units. The only rule that applies is that models must be armed with the same type of weapons. So, I mean, I've got guys in this unit that have axes and swords. That's perfectly fine. But some Hearthguard units, for example, in the Viking faction, they can have Dane axes or great axes, big 2-handed axes. And that's clearly going to be different than a guy who's armed with a small 1-handed axe and a shield. So I can construct my units into whatever numbers that I want, between 4 and a maximum of 12, of like equipped warriors. Swords and shields, spears and shields, etc, etc. So let's take all these guys back. I am going to choose to deploy my Hearthguard as a unit of 8, and I'm also going to deploy my warriors into units of 8. So now that I've chosen how I'm actually going to construct my force or deploy my units, let's talk about the deployment of these models onto the table. It's pretty much the same. There's a sequence that takes place, as there is with most games, and that sequence generally begins with a dice roll. Both players roll a d6 and the highest player gets to go first. Now I'll explain the order in which we deploy in just a second, but there's one caveat to this dice roll, and that's the fact that when you roll a draw, let's say we both roll up 5s. Now the rulebook does state that the player with the most impressive facial hair wins in the event of a draw. So I've taken advantage of this rule a couple of times and gone first. However, you could re-roll the dice or choose a different mechanic. It's really up to you. But the rulebook does state that the player with the most impressive facial hair wins in the event of a draw. Nonetheless, let's just say that I have won the turn, the roll. So I begin deployment. Now, I begin deployment by deploying my warlord onto the table. So let's just move these guys out of the way. And I deploy my warlord. It's the first stage. Basically, I'm setting the scene. So we've got these guys out of the way. I begin by deploying my warlord. Now, I can deploy within long of the table edge, again, that being 12 inches. So the head representing my table edge, I can deploy up to 12 inches from the table edge. So I'm going to go 12 inches in. Now I've deployed my warlord, my opponent would go ahead and deploy his warlord and all of his levy units. Once he's deployed his warlords and all of his levy units, I then go ahead and deploy all of my levies, in which case I don't have any, and all of my warriors. So again, 12 inches from the table edge, I might choose to place a unit over here. This might be a good time to point out unit coherency. It's not called unit coherency, I can't remember exactly what it's called, but how far each model has to be away from another model in its unit. So in this game, it's very short. It's 2 inches. I have to be within 2 inches of another model in my unit to maintain that coherency. So again, all of my warriors go out at this point, so I'm going to deploy one unit over there. I'm going to deploy another unit close to my warlord over here. And once I've done that, my opponent then goes ahead and deploys his warriors and all of his Hearthguard. Once he's done that, I'm left with my elite Hearthguard at the end to sort of position where I need to. Given the fact that my opponent has deployed everything that he's deployed, I'm keeping my special elite units in reserves until I see everything on the tabletop, and then I choose the best position for these guys. So in this case, I'm just going to dump them right here in the middle. That way they can go either direction depending on the ebb and flow of the battle. So that's the deployment phase. It's fairly quick, it's fairly straightforward. I deploy my warlord, my opponent deploys his warlord and his levies. I deploy my levies and my warriors. He then deploys his warriors and his Hearthguard. And then finally, to finish it off, I deploy my Hearthguard. Once deployment is finished, we begin the game with a dice roll. The highest player, the highest dice roll, again goes first. So in this case, I rolled a 6, my opponent rolled a 4, I would go first. The same special rule does apply here, that caveat about facial hair, whether you want to use it or not, it's written in the rule book. In the event of a tie, the player with the most impressive facial hair goes first. So in this case, I'd begin the game on that roll of 6. So there we go, there's our first introduction to Saga. The points explanation, how I recruit men, and then how I deploy at the beginning of the game and choose how I'm going to structure those men into various different types of units. In the next video, we'll talk about the orders phase, which is the beginning of each turn, both my turn and my opponent's, in which I roll our custom Saga dice and allocate those dice, depending on what I roll, to the various abilities that are represented on each faction's battle board, in terms of which units I want to activate, what special rules I foresee being used during that turn. So hope you stick with me if you're interested in learning about Saga. There's going to be another 3 or 4 videos to come as we go through all of the various mechanics, moving, shooting, melee, the orders phase, which is quite an integral part of the game, and it's what makes this game different from many other games that I've played. I've really been enjoying the game so far. I've had 5 games in the last couple of weeks and currently sitting on 3 wins and 2 losses. So hopefully I can improve that a little bit more with a few more games and a few more wins. But nonetheless, I'm really enjoying it. Win or lose, it's a great game. So I hope you stick with me. I'll catch you next time. Thanks for watching.